Okay, Psych 213 class, this is the last lecture, and it happens to be the same as the first lecture with a little bit of a few additional wrinkles, additional pieces of information, but I think you'll recognize all of this material and hopefully you have a different perspective now that you've made your complete journey through the class. So today we're going to talk about steps to improve your memory. And if you remember, the first thing I pointed out to you is that you gotta believe that you can change your memory. So this is what I mean by clear your mental hurdles. A lot of people think that memory is just a trait that you're born with, not that it's an active process. As you now know, both encoding and retrieval are processes, and you can do things to modify them. You can do things to improve them. So first you got to sort of believe that and then go to work and start working on change. The other thing is you need to increase your motivation, right? Where if we're not motivated to do anything for change, it's not going to happen. So how can you do that? You can goal set. So if you have a really big learning task, I recommend breaking it into small sub goals. It's really easy to feel overwhelmed, and when you feel overwhelmed, it certainly decreases your motivation. So when I feel that way, what I do is I try to go to work on the smallest piece of whatever the task is that I can do, and that makes me feel better. And when you start feeling better, you start increasing your motivation to do the next task. So don't be afraid to have it really small too. Just keep a small goal, and it can feel really good to achieve that goal. The other thing I would sort of say here is also just limit the impact of slips. So slip is when you fail to meet your goal, and it's going to happen. It's going to happen no matter what you're doing. We could be talking about improving your academic rigor. We could be talking about exercising. We could be talking about quitting smoking. Slips happen. And what you have to do is think about how you attribute that slip, right? So, is a slip an indicator that you can't do it? Like, I can't give up smoking, I can't exercise, I can't achieve this goal? Or is it just a temporary setback? And so I would encourage you to think of slips as just a temporary setback, go back to work, you can move forward. And sometimes we're going to take steps back. That's just the way it works. Rarely do we have a flawless path to something that's worth working for. The other thing for increasing your motivation is improve your concentration. And you can use classical and operant conditioning to do this, right? So routinize your location and time. And so that's classical conditioning. You'll start to get into a mode of thinking if you do the same time and place. And that place will become a cue for good studying, good concentration. Monitor your concentration. When it starts to fade, take breaks, and don't ever reward poor concentration. So if you get set up to study and you just have poor concentration, don't reward that. Take a break, come back when you have better concentration, and then reward yourself, right? Gradually increase your time between the breaks. So use shaping, right, to shape and increase the time that you can focus on something, have good motivation. When you are studying, use effective encoding strategies. We've learned a lot about these, right? So one thing is remove any distractions. So turn off your electronic devices so you're not distracted by texting or messaging or whatever. When you're reading or taking or looking at your notes, take notes, integrate the information with yourself. Think about how it relates to yourself, your interests, things you've already learned, right? This is an engagement effective learning strategy, right? Also do this during class too. Do the same thing. Vary your strategies to increase retrieval cues, right? So some material is going to lend itself to visual or auditory strategies. Just base it on the material, right? So some information could be incorporated into a scene. And imagery is very powerful, right? It's easy to remember things with very vivid images. And the more outrageous and more unique the scene, the better the memory is going to be. You're going to have less interference for that. So, like when I teach biological stuff in Psych 212 and biopsychology, I encourage students to think about the chemicals moving around, moving from one location to the other, using vivid mental imagery, right? That material lends itself to visual imagery. Not all material does. You also saw when reading Moonwalking with Einstein, that part of the strategy for remembering cards is to have very vivid imagery, right? So person, action, object can be really helpful, right? Other information does not lend itself to visual imagery. A lot of times we'll have lists of disconnected information, so that's when you should use a mnemonic of some kind, right? Make a rhyme or a song. That can be an effective auditory cue. Make lists into a sentence or a word and use the first letter of each word as a cue for individual retrieval pieces of information. Make up your own mnemonic. It could be individualized. Use the method of loci, right? Use rehearsal. That should be probably the last one that you use because rehearsal is usually the least effective. But just rehearsing the information can be effective, particularly if that's the only way you can make sense of the material. The other thing to do is organize the material. So put information into some sort of existing knowledge. See how concepts relate to one another. A lot of times you'll be asked to do that anyway on a test, and so that can be a really effective study technique. Now the fourth step is practice, practice, practice. So when you're doing these sorts of things, do this over and over again. Practice makes perfect, right? And the more you practice, the more the task gets easier because you're automating certain parts of that. You're building expertise, right? So remember the Snyder and Schifrin stuff, with the visual detection of letters amongst other letters, right? Or Neisser's secretary study, right? Or the stuff that you've learned or read about in Moonwalking with Einstein. Practice really does matter. The other thing you should do is distribute your practice. What that means is space it apart, distribute it across time, and make your own learning and test simulations and practice them. Practice taking a test, but distribute that across time. And now this is really important to distribute it across time because you'll get bigger gains than if you mass it all together. And a good example of this is comes from Keppel studies. You also read about this in the Willingham reflection. But subjects in this study learned word lists, and they had two groups, either a mass practice. So the practice was the same for both groups. It was the time between practice sessions that they varied. So the mass practice only had a 4-second break between practice sessions. The distributed practice had a 24-hour break between practice sessions. And then they looked at how much they remembered at intervals of 1 and 8 days. So this graph is going to show you memory loss, and you can sort of see the distributed group loses very little over that 8-day retention interval, but the massed group loses a ton of information, right? So what this tells us is that cramming doesn't really work for long-term retention. It might work okay for cramming that information in for the night of the exam. So if you're getting to a position where that's the only thing that you can do, I mean, I guess it's what you got to do, but it's not where you want to be, particularly if you want to keep the information for a long period of time, right? You got to distribute your practice, and a little bit each day is much more efficient than a lot in one day, right? That's the idea. So that's basically it. Hope you've enjoyed the class, and hope to see you soon.